So during the Classical Attic period, there was a subdialect of the Attic Greek language that was, in a lot of ways, similar to modern Greek. In some ways more conservative than it, but in a lot of ways even more innovative than modern Greek. This came to light to me by reading this wonderful work by Teodorsson, written in 1978, called The Phonology of Attic in the Hellenistic Period. And this book is actually the third part where he analyzes the statistical data for the pronunciation of Attic during the classical period and how it changed into the Hellenistic period. So from the 6th century BC through the 1st century BC, looking at the actual statistical spelling errors, neutralizations, and variants, which we'll see in detail. And it's absolutely amazing because there is very strong evidence for this vulgar Attic, as he calls it. This vulgar Attic pronunciation has generally been looked upon as mainly or exclusively by minor groups, tradefolk, workmen, and slaves. That is, it has been acknowledged to exist by quite a few people and researchers, but when trying to create the or a pronunciation of Greek, especially classical Greek, they're ignored because they don't represent everything. However, looking at these statistics, Teodorsson, back in 1978, came to the conclusion that indeed there is another vulgar variant of the language that is very well attested. And he goes on to say here, it was thought that this was just caused by external Boeotian or other influence from other dialects such as Boeotian, which did have a lot of the changes similar to modern Greek, but not nearly as complete. But that doesn't seem to be the case. These are actual Attic pronunciations, even if they may have come from somewhere else. To begin with, they were certainly Attic during the classical period. So not classical Attic, reconstructed, but vulgar Attic, if you will, just to give it a name. So what we're going to do in this video is look at the book, Teodorsson's findings in detail, and imagine what this vulgar Attic may have sounded like. We're going to see some examples from actual classical Attic texts, but rendered in more than one pronunciation, as we might reconstruct thanks to Teodorsson. And this 1978 work of Teodorsson is just the last in 3 parts. In the first, he looked just at Attic. In the second, he looked at Ptolemaic, so Egyptian. And in this, he looks again at Attic, but in the Hellenistic times, but he summarizes all of the data in this work, which is why we're looking at it, because he changes his mind on a few ideas that he had from the original work. The comprehensive study of orthographic variation in Attic showed that vulgar orthographic variants are rather frequent even in official documents, which suggests that the innovative pronunciation was more widespread in late classical times than has hitherto been recognized. Other kinds of evidence also supported this conclusion, but showed especially clearly that the conservative pronunciation was still used for centuries after the classical period. What's really interesting about this vulgar variant that we're going to look at is that it became extremely popular all the way up through the end of the classical period, and then Hellenistic times virtually vanished. That is something that looks like late Koine in certain ways, almost appears to have existed in the classical period, and yet vanished. And then things like it happened again centuries and centuries later. That's what's so fascinating about it, that it presages a lot of developments that would happen later, but they may not even be genetically linked. For example, all kinds of things like monophthongization of diphthongs. That happens in almost every language, as well as innovative diphthongs and so forth. And Greek tends towards monophthongization in all of its periods and in all of its dialects anyway. So it's not a foregone conclusion that monophthongization in 5th century BC is necessarily the genetic link to monophthongization centuries later. Could be, but we'll look at that in detail. Now, I've started to summarize a lot of these data in a new tab over on this, the Ranieri's Greek Pronunciation Chronology, Classical and Vulgar Attic Subsystems, based on Teodorsson 1978, so you can check that out as well at your leisure. These colors, by the way, the blue is for the conservative subsystem, and the gold is for the innovative subsystem. All of this is Attic, And the ones in between, this lighter blue is conservative, but it shows some things that are a little bit more similar to innovative, and this darker gold is the most innovative. There has always been a lack of systematic approach to the material, to the orthographic variants, which, among other factors, has given rise to quite diverging opinions on ancient Greek pronunciation. And this makes sense. People can look at innovative things happening in Classical Attic that are attested in inscriptions and other sorts of documentation and say, aha, that's just like modern Greek, therefore modern Greek pronunciation already existed in Classical Attic times. Of course, that's nonsense, but a lot of people seem to want to hang on to that. Other people say, completely ignore those variations. They have nothing to do with the real Classical Attic reconstructed pronunciation. And as we will see, there are in fact at least two significant subdialects that are concurrent in the what we call Classical Attic period. When is that, by the way? Well, on the chart, and all this in the gold color, is Classical Attic. Classical Attic goes roughly from 500 BC to 350 BC, so about a 150-year period. So that's Classical Attic. And it is also significant because when this ends, that's not when the innovations begin, that's essentially when they mostly end, which is very fascinating, as we'll see. An orthographic study is a phonemic graphemic relational study. All this is fantastic to help understand the methodology. These are what he calls tentative correspondences, that is, the pronunciations that we would expect according to, say, Allen's reconstruction of the Classical Attic pronunciation. So I'm going to take for granted that you know what that sounds like. He then talks about different factors which could cause these errors. They could be mechanical errors, they could be letters broken off that we just misunderstood or that were transcribed wrong. But ultimately, we have to consider that spelling errors are actually indicative of the internal phonological system of the person writing, and that accidents occur because there's an unconscious element to writing, that however conscious we might like to be, similar to speaking, mistakes will happen because they are automatic. However careful one might be in speech or in writing, these things do appear. The next section is on the orthographic data, and we're going to look at this in great detail. For now, I'm just going to skip through it so that we can get to the analysis of what these data mean, but we'll look at the different samples one at a time as we come to the various conclusions of Teodorsson. The orthographic data presented here are from Hellenistic times, but in the previous study he analyzed from the 6th, 5th, and 4th centuries as well. So his conclusions will be drawing on all of those data simultaneously. What's presented here is just the newer part of the study. This is sort of a secondary or final part to this study. Phonetic Evaluation. So the documents, where do they come from? The strictly private documents have been excluded from the data. So what we're looking at are state, subunit, and formal private documents so that we can have a fair comparison. There are some mentions of what the private documents show here and there, but the actual data are from people who you would think would know how to write, especially if they're doing inscriptions or other kinds of formal documentation. The sociolinguistic aspect is always considered in the evaluation of the data. The existence of synchronous subdialects is stated when the data indicate this, and the relative importance of the subdialects in different periods is studied. The main issue is the competition between the innovative popular and the conservative subdialects. And popular is interesting because it's in parentheses. We'll see that the innovative one of the hoi polloi, as we might say, ends up becoming so popular that it virtually changes the way that even the more conservative, more erudite people are speaking, the conservative subdialect. And then at the beginning of the Hellenistic period, the popularity of the innovative dialect vanishes almost entirely. So really interesting. Here is the first graphemic neutralization for variations 1 to 3. So what is that? I have a little note here, but this is what this is about. This is the same document. I just have it here for easy reference so we can all look at it. Variation number 1 is replacing epsilon iota with just iota. So what in classical pronunciation would be written with epsilon iota and be pronounced apemi, here is written apimi. And we see all kinds of examples of that, instead of a's, e's, and so forth. That is variation number 1. Of course, huge amounts of that. This is true of Hellenistic, but also is true in the classical Greek period, in the classical Attic period. So we have the nominative long iota, e, but that's also treated with epsilon iota. So we have ginestai, for example, instead of gignestai, as we would expect for something more classical Attic. That's variation number 2. And variation number 3 is very interesting. Variation number 3 is where there is a short iota, but represented by epsilon iota. For example, instead of oigian, it looks like it should be oigian. And that's very strange. Well, it's strange because if this occurs, it might suggest, for example, a loss of phonemic vowel length in that subdialect. Okay, the data are very interesting because they show that very, very suddenly, in front of a consonant, we see way more variant 1 suddenly in the 2nd and 1st centuries BC, as well as variant 2. And then, but variant 3 is where the short iota is replaced with epsilon iota. Well, those just seem to vanish after the 3rd century. And that's fascinating. Let's see what Teodorsson has to say about that. The phonetic change of A to E and the equalization of vowel length are the processes to be studied in this graphemic neutralization. Being dephonologizations and considering that the conditions are favorable to graphemic neutralization, one should expect them to produce frequent neutralization. For the time down to 200 BC, all 3 variations show rather high frequency, while in the last 2 centuries BC, variation 3 is very infrequent, especially as compared with variant 2 in that period. There's a very marked increase of frequency in the 1st century BC for variations 1 and 2, so where epsilon iota and long iota are switched, but not where short iota is replaced by epsilon iota, especially in the latter half. And here's something strange. The incidence of variation of the epsilon iota before a vowel, or iota before a vowel, and before a consonant, there's an increase before a consonant, but there's a decrease before a vowel. Well, what are his conclusions about all this? The change of A to E in front of a consonant that had already begun in the 6th century spread continuously in the population during the following centuries. After having spread to the majority in the 5th century, it also became general in the rest of the population in the Hellenistic period. This is, of course, consistent with how I represent Lucian pronunciation, where epsilon iota is just E in front of a consonant in all of the variants. In the position before a vowel, there was a different development. In the 4th century, the E pronunciation was rather widespread in the population, even in that position. It is obvious, however, that in the innovative subsystem in which E had closed into E, even before a vowel, there was an open allophone in this position. The decrease of incidence of neutralization 1 before a vowel, that's this neutralization that we're talking about now, in the last 2 centuries BC, as compared with the rapid increase before a consonant, shows that the proportion of speakers using the E pronunciation in that position was smaller in that period than the 4th and 3rd centuries. So something like Alexandria was pronounced Alexandria more regularly in the 4th and 3rd centuries, but then that stopped happening during Hellenistic times. That confusion became less common, so something like Alexandria was more common during Hellenistic period, and it wasn't until much later, during the beginning of the Roman period, that we get Alexandria again in orthography. The striking difference in frequency between variations 2 and 3 in the last 2 centuries BC, in comparison with the pattern of the preceding 4 centuries, in which variation 3, short iota being replaced by epsilon iota, is equally, or in the 4th and 3rd centuries, more frequent, shows that the proportion of speakers lacking the length phoneme, lacking phonemic vowel length, was much smaller in the 2nd and 1st centuries. So, according to Teodorsson, the data show absolutely that during the classical period, during the 5th and 4th centuries BC, there were Attic speakers, there were Athenians who just didn't have phonemic vowel length anymore, but that after the 4th century, almost nobody lacked phonemic vowel length. It made a complete reversion. Absolutely fascinating and bizarre. We'll see more really interesting things. The next variations we see here, variation 4, 5, and 6, he said that these are infrequent, but they do provide some evidence for a change of A to E. So there we go. Now here's the really crazy type. The normative spelling is epsilon, but the variant is with iota. For example, ilas. Now notice how few they are, but this is going to be an important section. The incidence of this neutralization in the last 3 centuries BC is very insignificant. So this is 7 and 8, right? So variation 8, the normative iota, represented by an epsilon. So that's interesting, them instead of dim. And the opposite, like we saw, ilia. So there are only 4 examples of this. So it is insignificant. We can agree with that. But remember, these are the Hellenistic data. The orthographic data from study number 1, showing what was happening in the classical Attic period. That's not given here in this particular paper or book because it's in study number 1. But let's compare it. In earlier times, or more exactly before 350 BC, it was not so. After the 4th century, variation practically ceases. What's really weird and fascinating and bizarre, though, is that the classical Attic period shows the very, very frequent interchange of epsilon and iota, to the point that it's not insignificant. It can't be dismissed as something that's not part of the way people actually spoke. Nevertheless, after the 4th century, after the classical period is over, this non-classical type variation ceases. It's as if what we think of as the classical pronunciation becomes dominant again. The Ptolemaic data show a similar chronological distribution, with the exception that the frequency begins to decrease about a century later than in Attic and never reaches such a low rate. That's very interesting. This would suggest an exportation of a certain, say, vulgar Attic pronunciation type that eventually becomes popular a century later in Egypt in the Ptolemaic data. So what are his conclusions about this madness? Why would epsilon be represented by iota? Why would iota be represented by epsilon? Well, the frequent Attic graphemic neutralization of epsilon and iota in the 4th century was interpreted by Teodorsson in the 1974, the first part of the series, as evidence of a tendency of the short vowels e and e to merge, but not as evidence of an actual merger, seeing that in modern Greek these original vowels have merged with an original I and E, respectively. So this is where he changed his mind. It is obvious, however, that the rather high incidence of the graphemic neutralization epsilon and iota in the 4th century Attic may be explained as evidence of actual merger of E and E in the phonemic system of a considerable part of the population. So, in classical Attic times, the innovative and, in fact, probably dominant pronunciation of epsilon was actually E and not E or E. And he dismissed this idea previously, even though he was looking at the data, because, well, that doesn't lead to modern Greek. So the conclusion that he comes to in this whole amazing work here is that we have an innovative subdialect, some of whose features may eventually have contributed to the innovations in Koine that lead to medieval Byzantine pronunciation, that lead to modern Greek pronunciation. But a lot of them do not. And this is one of them. This is pretty weird. The conclusion is supported by further evidence of the neutralization of the epsilon iota and epsilon, which also indicates that the phonetic quality of the sound was E. On the other hand, the virtual cessation of the graphemic neutralization of epsilon and iota in the 3rd century shows that from about 250 on, there were practically no speakers of Attic who lacked the phonemic distinction E to E. So there we go. This is the really amazing thing about this piece to me, that we have, instead of epsilon, like say echo, I have, in the restored classical pronunciation of Attic Greek, so not echo. In fact, the epsilon has to be high anyway. It has to be echo. It was actually echo. Absolutely bizarre. Not something I ever would have expected. But that such a pronunciation, echo, that was essentially completely lost, certainly in Attica, by the 3rd century. Truly, truly astonishing. In the early 4th century, the phonetic quality of E may have been rather similar to E, even in the subsystem or subsystems, which preserved the phonological opposition between the sounds. This suggests something like a very high E as opposed to E. So you have E and E. Very difficult to distinguish, so maybe instead of equal, almost exactly the same, though. Very difficult to distinguish, and hence the confusion in writing. Soon, probably about the middle of that century, this is the 4th century, however, the opening process in that vowel set in, and then continued until it had reached the quality eh. This seems to have happened by about the middle of the 3rd century. So by the middle of the 3rd century, we get echo again instead of equal or equal. Now, that doesn't mean we have the E itself opening. It's not like those speakers actually genetically passed on echo to become echo. It's more likely that the equal one just died out completely, and that the more conservative pronunciation of echo turned into one where the epsilon opened into e. In fact, how we use epsilon in IPA. So echo instead of equal. Evidence for this is the low frequency of neutralizations between epsilon iota and epsilon and eta and epsilon, and the virtual absence of this long diphthong epsilon iota, or represented, say, more standard-wise as eta iota, this is the subscript one, from that time on. So we'll talk more about that as we go on. Epsilon iota and just epsilon. These are variations 9 and 10. Okay, so here it is. Epsilon iota, that would be the tentative E, but the variation is a simple epsilon. So instead of is, epsilon iota sigma, it would just be S, or it would seem like S or is or something. What could this mean? That's very particular. Here we have grukia, and it's just glukea. Something that's worth mentioning, I mention this in almost every video where I talk about Greek phonology, epsilon iota doesn't represent a diphthong for classical Attic pronunciation. Even in the most conservative varieties, it only had a diphthongal pronunciation before the 6th century BC. And that was only for certain words. The way that we standardize our spellings now, the spellings that are considered here, especially for the Hellenistic data, there's absolutely no way that epsilon iota is representing a diphthongal A sound in a word like, say, epsilon iota pi epsilon nu, which is, of course, ipin in the restored classical pronunciation. The way that a lot of people do it in the Erasmian type pronunciation is to say apin, but that's, of course, wrong. It's not a diphthong. But I'm, of course, taking for granted that you already know the classical Attic pronunciation. So in variation 9, we see plenty of epsilons taking the place of epsilon iota, both before consonants as well as before vowels. So we have, for example, hiereas instead of hiereas, which is apparently what we would expect there. Here we have the haplography of estelin, where the sigma is also taken out. Very interesting. This is variation 10, where epsilon iota is taking the place of a plain epsilon. For example, hierea is hierea, which is very, very interesting. So this neutralization is highly concentrated to the 4th century and to the position before a vowel. In the 3rd century, there is a marked decrease of frequency, particularly from circa 250 on, and it then remains insignificant throughout the Hellenistic period. There is always a predominating incidence before a vowel. It is observed that the numerous instances of epsilon iota for epsilon before a vowel in the 4th century are almost exclusively found in documents other than the strictly private ones. This differs significantly from the situation in Teodorsson 1974 regarding the iota and epsilon, where this small group of documents, the private ones, supplies nearly half of the total number of instances, and the eta and epsilon confusion, or neutralization, in which almost 2/3 of the instances are found in strictly private documents. For those people where epsilon and iota both corresponded to E, and epsilon iota before a vowel corresponded to E, these people were less apt to substitute epsilon iota for the epsilon, or the reverse, than those in whom both epsilon and epsilon iota in front of a vowel both corresponded to A sounds. So for the innovative subdialect, for epsilon iota in front of a vowel, that must have been E. It wasn't an E yet, as it is in, say, modern Greek, or even in the majority of Koine. The innovative subdialect would have had something like Alexandria. And how do we know that? Because the documents that are written by people who use the innovative subdialect, they weren't replacing epsilon iota with a simple epsilon. They were much better about keeping this very consistent, whereas the more conservative variant did confuse epsilon with epsilon iota. And this suggests that for the majority of speakers in both conservative and innovative in their subdialect, before a vowel, epsilon iota was E and not E. The largely complementary distribution in the 4th century of the graphemic neutralization epsilon with epsilon iota in front of a vowel on the one hand, and epsilon and iota and eta and epsilon on the other, this purple one that I've highlighted, that would be the E. They would say all these as E. This would be the eticism and ioticism all the way. Shows that these two groups of neutralizations were to a large extent produced by people with different phonemic systems. In the phonemic system of the writers of the latter group are the more innovative ones who are saying E for epsilon, so they're saying equal instead of equal. In the phonemic system of the writers of the latter group, the innovative one, all three graphemes, iota, epsilon, and eta, most probably corresponded to E sounds. If, in the same writers, epsilon iota in front of a vowel corresponded to an A sound, this explains why these writers apparently produce so few instances of the neutralization epsilon iota and epsilon. That is, if epsilon makes an E sound, but epsilon iota makes an A sound, well, they wouldn't replace these. But if you're the conservative subdialect, your A and your E sound pretty similar, so you might actually make that transposition. And that's what we see. However, there are some instances in the neutralization epsilon and iota that, in the former half of the 4th century, the E pronunciation for epsilon had spread even among writers of official documents. Insofar as this was the case, the neutralization of epsilon iota with epsilon in front of a vowel evidences an E sound as correspondent to epsilon iota even in front of a vowel. It may be then that the merger of both long E in front of a vowel and E into the corresponding E sounds had spread equally in the population, but probably not in the same groups of speakers by about the middle of the 4th century. But this development did not reach its conclusion. There was always a considerable number of speakers who preserved the opposition of A and E. So an idea of competition between the innovative and the conservative subdialects, that's an interesting way to think about it. So I've tried to represent this here. We have epsilon iota in front of a consonant and epsilon iota in front of a vowel. These go in order from most conservative to most innovative. The two groups that are slightly separate but also intermingling are the conservative subdialect and the innovative ones. This is even more innovative, and this is slightly less conservative, if that makes sense. These two are the ones that are kind of interacting with each other, or they're showing some sharing. So the epsilon iota in front of a consonant, for example, in the word ipon is getting pronounced ipon even by the majority of the people using the conservative dialect. Let's imagine they're more erudite. And then the more popular or the more innovative variant, well, that's been E since pre-classical times, most likely. And also this one here, this is representing how phonemic vowel length is lost in this group as well. Notice how, of course, it vanishes, it goes away. Eventually, by the beginning of Hellenistic times, the E pronunciation of a word like ipon, that's over, and it's just ipon from there on out. And the orthographic data support this, at least for Attic. So this would be post-classical Attic. That's pre-classical Attic. Here is epsilon iota in front of a vowel. Now, we're coming in from pre-classical Attic times with a long E sound. Before the 6th century, there were some of them, roughly half of them, were A diphthongs, true diphthongs, and the rest are just E. They've all become A at this point. And we're not talking about the long eta iota subscript one. We'll talk about that one later because it's a particular case morphologically. So what seems to have happened is that the conservative subdialect took from the innovative subdialect the E pronunciation of epsilon iota in front of a consonant. So we can see this kind of ramping up here, and eventually it comes to dominate through all of Greek from the end of the classical period to the present day. But in front of a vowel, the innovative one never turns this into an E pronunciation during the classical period. It remains an E for the first level innovative. The second one, where phonemic vowel length is lost, it would just be an E sound. However, in the conservative subdialect, there are two variants here. In one of those variants, the epsilon iota in front of a vowel, which is E in front of a consonant, that gets its way worked in also in front of a vowel. And that starts to interfere. So something that was taken from innovative in a different environment starts to become even more dominant in the conservative one. This is truly bizarre stuff. And keeps going like this. The thing that happens, though, at this point, which isn't represented very well on this chart, is that the pronunciation of E before a vowel in the conservative subsystem, and in fact in pretty much all of the subsystems, it's essentially quashed entirely. They seem to still exist, but they're almost entirely gone. But from about here, 300 forward, this is the dominant pronunciation, just E all of the time, and never anything else. Until finally, by the end of the 1st century BC, we see E again. So let's imagine that there are just some few remnants of the popular system that eventually work their way to make this the pronunciation before a vowel again, both in conservative and innovative. That's my understanding of this. The marked decrease of incidence of the neutralization epsilon iota and epsilon by about 300 indicates that either of the two sounds involved had changed its phonetic character. Since there was no decisive evidence to show that the E sound corresponding to epsilon iota in front of a vowel changed into E in increasing numbers of Attic speakers after 300, but strong evidence to the contrary, that's what I can't represent over on my chart here, the safe conclusion is that E changed into E, and that this pronunciation also won over most of the people who had pronounced E as corresponding to E. So that is represented here, that the pronunciation of epsilon is not E, but E in the classical period, and that what happens is that this gets pronounced essentially as a high E here, but probably E is better for all the variants. But then, starting here around the beginning of the 3rd century, there is something from the conservative subdialect where the E opens to E. So instead of eko, well then of course the omega closes to O, so instead of eko, eko, so that becomes E. And that ends up completely quashing this E pronunciation of epsilon. So it goes away in the innovative subsystem. It's absolutely gone. It never comes back. Ptolemaic is a different story, but this is what happens for Attic and happens to be general through Koine as well. This opening change is also otherwise known to be a historical fact. As this change is established, the continuation, although always infrequent, of neutralization 4, that is, which neutralization that's this one, epsilon iota for epsilon, in prevocalic position throughout the Hellenistic period indicates that, on the one hand, the sound corresponding to epsilon was more closed in front of a vowel than elsewhere. It's interesting. And on the other, that epsilon iota in front of a vowel corresponds to an A sound. The unchanging low frequency of neutralization in front of a consonant indicates that the phonetic quality of the tentative A and E was always different in this position in the phonemic system of most speakers of Attic, since E changed generally into E in front of consonants in the classical period, whereas in the conservative subdialect, the short epsilon E never changed into an E. It remained A and eventually opened to E. Neutralization number 5, eta and epsilon being confused. So these are variations 11 and 12. There we are, variation 11 and variation 12. Very interesting. So variation 12 where we have the eta taking place of the epsilon and the inverse for variation 11. Not a whole lot of examples of these, but there were a lot more in the classical period. This graphemic neutralization is very frequent in the 4th century, not on this page, but quite infrequent in the last 3 centuries BC. So this is the infrequent. Conclusions. The conclusive evidence of the graphemic neutralization of eta and iota, which we talked about earlier, which is rather frequent in the 5th and 4th centuries, demonstrates that the tentative phoneme e had changed into e in the 5th century in large groups of Attic speakers. This is the innovative variant. The so-called strictly private documents can be assumed to have been written above all by those speakers. And the 3 neutralizations, epsilon iota, eta epsilon, eta iota, the proportion of data from that group of documents is oversized during the time down to circa 300. So we're talking about the innovative subdialect. All of these are E. It was concluded above that epsilon corresponded in the 4th century to E in a considerable part of the population. It then seems necessary to assume that the neutralization eta epsilon was to a large extent produced by people whose pronunciation was an E sound for both graphemes. The rapid decrease of incidence of the neutralization eta epsilon after 300 indicates that the sounds corresponding to the two graphemes were then no longer alike. The cause was the ongoing opening process of E into E at the time, which is also evidenced by the chronological distribution of the neutralizations epsilon iota and epsilon iota to epsilon. The sound corresponding to epsilon became E in almost the entire population, while the corresponding eta remained E, or in minor groups, E. So let's see how I have represented that over here. So here is eta. Eta becomes a long E sound by the middle of the 5th century BC for a number of speakers, and certainly by the 4th century, that same innovative variant is, it's not statistically represented between these two colors, but it is demonstrated here to still be there. And we also have those who have lost phonemic vowel length represented in this darker gold. Meanwhile, the old A pronunciation of eta, well, that was of course already E for the innovative variant. It remained E for the most conservative variant of Classical Attic, the one on which the orthographic system is, of course, based, coming at the end of the 5th century, but was closing into E, borrowed from the innovative variant, most likely, or influenced by them, and then continues on until this more innovative E sound ends up becoming the dominant one. But I left this open E because he does mention that there are some pieces of evidence that E continues down towards the 1st century. The few instances of the neutralization of eta epsilon and epsilon iota epsilon in the Hellenistic period may suggest a more closed pronunciation, possibly E corresponding to epsilon, especially before a vowel. We talked about that earlier. As regards the tentative E grapheme of eta, the marked decrease of incidence of the neutralization of eta and epsilon after 300 demonstrates that this had changed into E in the 4th century, even in the phonemic system of most speakers of the conservative dialect. And that's what we saw here, that most people in the conservative dialect are going to say E now, but there are still some that say E, and I've left those in parentheses. The preserved pronunciation E is suggested by the few instances of the neutralization of eta and epsilon for a minor group of speakers, provided that the tentative E had opened to E in the phonemic system of those people. Neutralization 6, variations 13 to 14. So 13 to 14, epsilon and iota, the E being confused with the eta. Well, like we just said, the eta was already E, no longer E. So we have eke instead of eke. So instead of bias, epsilon iota, we have bias represented with the eta. And quite a few examples of that. And the inverse, of course, is also represented. The distributional pattern of this neutralization is remarkable. Chronologically, there is the very low frequency during the entire space of time before the late 2nd century, and the high frequency in the 1st century BC. Environmentally, neutralization is almost totally confined to the position before a vowel, but not until 175 BC is there an instance in that position. Considering that there is decisive evidence showing that the sound corresponding to epsilon iota in front of a consonant and eta was E in a large part of the population, as early as the 5th century, one would expect the neutralization of eta and epsilon iota to be quite frequent from that time onwards, above all in front of a consonant, but that is not the case. It is noticeable that the chronological distribution of the above variant 13, that's this one, is almost exactly the same as variant 19. Conclusions. The insignificant frequency of the neutralization eta and epsilon iota in front of a consonant in the 5th and 4th centuries is apparently due to non-phonetic or orthographic causes. The cause of the sudden increase was then probably non-phonetic orthographic. It is well known that as early as the beginning of the 4th century, that is on the introduction of the Ionic graphic system in the year 403 BC, the graphemic sequence epsilon iota was used more and more frequently instead of eta iota as corresponding to the tentative a, which had then been monophthongized and narrowed into a or e. So, such as the subjunctive legei with the epsilon iota ending, phonetically, that had already changed to a or e, and thus representing it with the eta, although that would have made sense 100 years prior to the 403 adoption year, it no longer really made sense, which is why they started writing it this way. So this is, in a sense, an incorrect way to represent the morphology, epsilon iota, however, is a much more correct way with pronunciation, since this is a or e, and that would have not been. Then, in the second half of the 2nd century, the old sequence eta iota, the subscript iota of eta, was suddenly reintroduced. So this is the long diphthong. The simultaneous onset of high frequency in variation 13 and 19 clearly indicates a common cause. This was the scrupulous endeavor of the writers to duly replace epsilon iota with eta iota, a task they did not entirely manage. Not only do they often omit iota, but they also occasionally replaced epsilon iota in the wrong position. The practically exclusive occurrence of variation 13 in front of a vowel demonstrates that a, epsilon iota in front of a consonant corresponded to a sound of another phonetic quality than in front of a vowel. That is, it was an e sound in front of the consonant. B, that eta did not correspond to an e sound. It is obvious that epsilon iota in front of a vowel and eta corresponded to a quite similar or identical a sound. So that makes sense. Also, the epsilon iota graphically was reintroduced. This is something that Alan comments on in his chart in Volksgrike, and he shows a little chart so as it goes backwards. It's very interesting, strange development, and probably also pronunciation accompanied that. So they tried to bring back the long diphthong that we write as eta subscript iota. They probably tried to pronounce it a, and then it just became a again, and eventually, of course, ioticized, as everything did. All right, neutralization 7, variations 15 and 16. This is iota replacing eta, and eta replacing iota. Notice that there are very few instances of this in the Hellenistic data, but the data not shown here for Attic, of course, has a lot of this. There's a marked decrease of incidence of this graphemic neutralization after 300 as compared with that of the 4th century. In the 3rd century, frequency is almost reduced to 1/3 of the 4th century rate, and it is also lower in the 2nd century. Only in the 1st century does this incidence increase again. The insignificant absolute frequency as such, only 2 instances dated with certainty in the 3rd century, also detracts very much from the evidence of this neutralization in the Hellenistic period. Conclusions. The change of a to e had taken place during the classical period, and the continued narrowing into e had spread widely in the population. So, of course, that is already represented here. The eta closes to e for people in the innovative, and for the classical period it had already become e for plenty of people, and eventually the e pronunciation comes to dominate, like we mentioned before. Then the radical decrease of incidence of the neutralization of eta and iota from the beginning of the 3rd century demonstrates that the proportion of speakers in whose phonemic system eta corresponded to e had increased rapidly at the time. So 3rd century is here. So what I have done is I've completely removed this at all from the innovative subsystem. There certainly could have been people in the innovative subsystem that retained eta as eta, but not necessarily. Here I'm showing how the conservative subsystem ended up somehow. We'll talk about the sociolinguistic factors. The conservative subsystem ended up influencing, from the 3rd century, the innovative subsystem to take on a again instead of e for this sound. There is no decisive evidence to show that the subdialect in which eta corresponded to an e sound ever regained in Hellenistic times the position it had held in the 4th century. Eventually, the a does again close to e in well after the first couple centuries AD. Variations 17 and 18, infrequent, insignificant. Variations 19 and 20. 19 and 20. 19 and 20. So this is the tentative a diphthong, and it's almost always a morphological grammatical thing. So a, they, like the dative and so forth. So that's what these all are. And wow, is there a lot of them in the Hellenistic period. So it shows how the iota subscript is meaning it's meaning something else. And then the variation 20, which is putting the subscript, as we call it, or as we write it today, writing eta iota where it doesn't belong at all. And there are some examples of that as well. The conclusion is that the monophthongization and narrowing of A into E is demonstrated by, among others, the graphemic neutralizations eta iota, eta, and eta iota, epsilon iota, especially for the 4th century. So this had become E in the 4th century. The fact that the decrease of incidence of eta for eta iota is synchronous with the rapid increase of the use of epsilon iota instead of eta iota show that these phenomena are related. The main cause of the decrease of the variant eta for eta iota is orthographic. This is also true of the sudden increase of variation 19 in the second half of the 2nd century because of the reintroduction of this grapheme. The determination of the phonetic quality of the sound corresponding to eta iota in the Hellenistic period is only possible if the parallel evidence of neutralizations 1, 6, and 7 is taken into consideration. So probably what happened here, like I said, I haven't finished updating this, hopefully it will be updated by the time this video is published, is that the eta subscript iota, at least morphologically where it belongs, like say subjunctive endings or dative endings for first declension nouns, it was a, and that pronunciation keeps going until about the beginning of the Koine period, where we expect it to be close to a in the most conservative subdialect, but for majority of speakers, it already closed to e anyway. So there could have been variations here how it was pronounced. In any case, later it gets restored back to e, and then eventually the diphthongal pronunciation goes away entirely by this time. Here, let me just update that. There we go. So by the 1st century, all subscripts are essentially gone anyway. So they all are influencing each other. The restoration of the e pronunciation of epsilon iota may have taken place only in grammatical morphemes, and Allen's chart shows this, of course. Now, what about these interchanges with just a plain epsilon? It is remarkable that there is no instance of this neutralization dated between 248 and 140 BC. Conclusions: this instance hints at the e pronunciation of eta iota, especially earlier, then it gets restored, and then eventually it'll close again in later Koine. Variations 25 to 28. All right, we're finally leaving the e and e sounds. We're finally getting to a different vowel sound. A lot of detail in this. It's very good. This is the kind of detail that's necessary for tackling these issues. 25, we have the nominative alpha iota, and this one corresponding to the long diphthong I. Well, the variation is simply a. So losing the iota subscript. That's the first group here. And we see that we also have just a plain alpha being replaced by alpha iota. So instead of basi, we have baisi. Probably the person just pronounced basi though, and they assumed that the iota was just a signifier of the long vowel. 27 and 28 will be the short diphthong. But first, the first group is represented as early as 500 BC. So from the very beginning of the classical period, the innovative subgroup had already ditched the iota subscript, as we call them. The long diphthongs had monophthongized. Incredibly early, considering how most people talk about that. Of course, it wasn't true in the conservative subdialect, because we know those continued on to be pronounced since Latin has comoidus, comoidia, from the Greek komoidia. So the long diphthong was clearly retained long enough for Latin to pick up on it. So it didn't go away for all speakers, not in the conservative subdialects for sure, but for the innovative popular subdialect, yeah, it was gone. The frequency as related to the extent of the corpus is roughly equal during the 5th to 3rd centuries, while the 2nd century, there's an increase. So these get more popular in the 2nd century. In the 1st century, the incidence is about 4 times higher. In the 2nd century, this is consistent precisely with the Latin transcriptional data, where the tragoidus, the comoidus, those ois are retained, but then rhapsodus doesn't have it anymore. A word taken in the 1st century BC, rhapsodus, whereas comoidus, tragoidus, and so forth, those are all taken in the previous centuries. So it corresponds extremely well with what we have with the Latin. And these also correspond with the long diphthongs of the eta and the omega as well. So it's very interesting how they all they're all gone in the innovative, and then they go away even in the conservative by the beginning of the Roman era of Koine, that is by the end of the 1st century BC. Conclusions. The graphemic neutralization alpha iota, long alpha iota, and alpha as occurring during the 5th to 3rd centuries demonstrates that the phonetic change I to A had been accomplished in a large number of Attic speakers in that period. The marked increase of frequency of neutralization in the second half of the 2nd century shows that the change then also spread to the remaining part of the population. So this idea of spreading is certainly an effective way to conceive of these things. So we have this I pronunciation is retained all the way till about here. Then I have it gone for all of the 1st century. It's possible it was retained even later for some speakers, but certainly the innovative one, which was well, that was here, but then went away for the conservative subdialect because the more traditional pronunciation became dominant again. But the innovative subdialect was hanging on to it till finally, boop, it comes up here, and then boop, skips up into the dominant conservative pronunciation as well. The change was unconditioned, meaning it didn't depend on environment in front of a vowel or whatever. The diphthong I, so the variations 27 to 28, those are alpha iota being exchanged for just alpha. And 28, it is the inverse. So these don't occur a lot in Hellenistic times, but they were pretty frequent in the 5th and 4th centuries. And then in Hellenistic times, 3rd, 2nd, 1st centuries, they basically vanish. Now, what's that about? The rapid decrease of incidence from the beginning of the 3rd century and the following low frequency throughout the Hellenistic period is notable. The neutralization is most frequent in front of an initial vowel of another word, except in the 2nd and 1st centuries where it is most common in front of a consonant. The latter is also true in Ptolemaic Koine, where alpha for alpha iota is twice as frequent in this position as in front of a vowel. So what does this all mean? I into A is decisive, in particular for the 4th century. The high frequency of neutralization, even in official documents, demonstrates that the new monophthong was also widespread among speakers of the conservative subdialect at that time. I've represented that here. We see the diphthong I is the old one, already becoming I in the pre-classical innovative pronunciation, but then A during the classical period becoming E. I don't know if it should be A or E depending, but the A pronunciation had creeped up even into the conservative variant, and that's what's very interesting. But that gets quashed, and that goes away. Then the reaction set in and succeeded in reversing the trend so that increasing numbers of Attic speakers from the 3rd century onwards pronounced I. The existence of the not infrequent neutralization of I to A in correspondence to the tentative I throughout the Hellenistic period demonstrates that there were considerable groups of speakers who had the monophthongal pronunciation. Just made a little update here to show that it's either going to be A or E for the innovative subgroup in the Hellenistic period. Some are going to have A, some are going to have E. Hard to say which one is which. It also demonstrates that this isn't like modern Greek where it has to be E, because there's no reasonable occasion to replace alpha iota with just alpha unless it's an A pronunciation. That makes a lot more sense than E, although there's evidence for the E monophthong as well. More evidence of the monophthongization of I into A or E. Conclusions. The monophthongal pronunciation of A was less common in the Hellenistic period than in the 4th century. So that can't be seen here, but the idea here is that these pronunciations, yeah, that exist, but they were pretty rare. Here's the other super weird group. So we're talking 41 to 42. 41 to 42. Well, what are these about? These are all about upsilon and iota trading places. And they certainly do. The evidence for this shows that 4th century, super common U was in fact actually E, but then, bam, 3rd century, pretty much gone. And that pronunciation didn't really exist anymore. The decrease of incidence of neutralization 15a by about the middle of the 3rd century, which continues in the following 2 centuries, indicates that the proportion of Attic speakers who possessed the phonological opposition of E and U was greater in Hellenistic than in the classical period. So in the classical period, this is so interesting that there were people as far back as the 5th and the 6th centuries where U had actually closed to E in Attic, not in the more conservative variant or conservative subdialect, but in the innovative one there were, and then they certainly existed here, and then a whole bunch in the 4th century. Really just amazing that occurred, and then it was mostly reversed and went away. This makes sense because, of course, U remains the pronunciation of upsilon even into some modern Greek dialects, as attested in the 19th century. See the upsilon video on the main Polymathy channel, because I went into a lot of detail about that. However, there was a subdialect in Attic that did that, and then it was essentially extinguished from the 3rd century onward. So when upsilon becomes E again later in the later medieval into modern Greek, that is essentially a separate development. It's not genetically related necessarily to what was going on in the Vulgar Attic. Now we're getting into another fun one. Oi. So what happens to the oi diphthong? Well, it gets switched for all kinds of things. And these are variations 47 through 51, so let's look at those. 47, not a whole lot of these in the Hellenistic data. And the inverse, okay, oi, o, and so forth, not a huge amount of all of these. But what happened in the classical period? The evidence of a monophthongal pronunciation in correspondence to oi is very insignificant for the Hellenistic period. That's what we just looked at here. Only quite small groups of Attic speakers may have used it after the traditional diphthong oi had regained its predominating position in the 3rd century. However, as was demonstrated in the other work, oi had definitely closed into u by the 4th century in the innovative variant. So in the innovative subdialect, upsilon and omicron iota did not merge. I believe something like this is also true for Boeotian. Omicron iota, oi, and then into ui in the less conservative version of the conservative subsystem. So oi, ui, u then became the u sound, but represented like this, whereas the actual u, the upsilon, had closed into e. Different from the merger that happens in medieval Greek. So this again demonstrates how this is not genetically related to what comes later, but is just weirdly similar. Then we have the fun ones with the diphthong eu. What happens there? The conclusion: the phonetic change into a semivocalic or consonantal quality of the second component of the diphthong eu was widespread in late classical times. This phonetic development was checked, and the old diphthongal pronunciation was used again by increasing numbers of Attic speakers. This process seems to have begun in the late 4th century. By about 250, there was only a minority using the progressive pronunciation. So this progressive pronunciation ends up becoming the important dominant one later. So it was eu, and then eu in the innovative becomes eu, just an or eu. But this eu eventually gets eliminated, and it goes back to a normal eu as it was before. So what this does is it explains why the upsilon isn't written in so many of these situations, such as in variation 52. And this was very common in the classical period. This does not mean, however, any kind of fricativization was occurring yet. The absence of the neutralizations of eo to f, and eo to eb shows that the tentative p and b corresponding to phi and beta, respectively, had not changed into fricatives, even by the end of the Hellenistic period. Again, this is the situation for Attic, whereas we see different things over in Egypt and even in Italy. See my video on Phi Theta Chi on the main Polymathy channel for that discussion. Then we have the same situation with the au diphthong, variations 60 through 64. The primordial stage of fricativization of the second element of the diphthong au is suggested by the infrequent neutralization of au for a. That is not au, but au. Just that would W sound, au. in the 5th and 4th centuries. The cessation of the neutralization in the late 4th century indicates a retardation of the development for about 2 centuries. Minor or literate groups of speakers most probably retained the progressive pronunciation during that period. That one eventually becomes dominant. So some things are totally quashed and don't come back. Other things are retained. The onset of high frequency of neutralization 18a, about 50 BC, shows that the suspended phonetic change was then spreading in the population again. So it never went away, but it ends up coming back. It is not very probable that the renewed onset of the frigativizational development of au in Attic in the 1st century was due to influence from the Koine pronunciation in other parts of the Greek-speaking area, such as in Alexandria. So this is not probable. It is more natural and nearer to hand to assume that this change propagated from minor or illiterate groups within the Attic community. And there are no neutralizations of the type au ap or af or au ab or av in Hellenistic Attic, so that change hadn't occurred. So we don't have a fricativization of au as av or eo as ev, nor do we have fricatives for either of those consonants. Now, there are a lot of interchanges with omega and omicron in Hellenistic period, and they could be the merger of the equalization of vowel length. This is something that, for example, Buth talks a lot about and says that this is, of course, clear evidence. Allen, however, says, no, that just means that their quality is the same. There is no decrease of incidence of the neutralization of omega omicron in the 3rd century, as was the case with a number of other autographemic neutralizations. On the contrary, there's an increase of frequency in that century, considering that the corpus ratio in the 4th to 3rd centuries is this. The frequency shows a further slight increase in the 2nd century, while there is a decrease in the 1st century. So there often was a confusion prior in the omega and omicron, and it stays the same or increases. But everything else that was related to vowel length sharply decreased. So what this shows is that it's a confusion based on the quality and not about the length. Conclusions. The high frequency of the neutralization omega omicron in classical times, as well as in the Hellenistic period, demonstrates the phonetic change of aw to oo for the 5th and 4th century. That's the key takeaway for omega. The change was unconditioned, and it did not only belong to the innovative subdialect, but was also part of the phonemic system of most speakers of the conservative subdialect. There was no tendency towards restoration of the old pronunciation in the Hellenistic period, unlike the others. On the contrary, the new pronunciation seems to have spread even more from the 3rd century on. So, therefore, not a vowel length thing, just a quality thing. The next interchange of the long omega diphthong oi, monophthongizations, namely oi to u or u or something like that, and oi to o, propagated particularly rapidly from the 4th century. From the beginning of the 3rd century, the trend was reverted. The proportion of speakers with a diphthongal pronunciation oi as well as oi increased markedly. More with the long oi diphthong. Here is an interesting chart. We see a lot in the 4th century, and then they went away, and then huge increase again. So in the 2nd and 1st century, this suggests that, like we saw before, the loss of the long diphthong pronunciation entirely. The striking increase of frequency in the 4th century, as well as the following rapid decrease in 3rd century, are highly significant features. Conclusions. The conspicuous fluctuations in the frequency of neutralization 22a demonstrate that a. The monophthongization oi to o propagated rapidly in the population in the 4th century. B. That this process stopped and the diphthongal pronunciation regained a dominating position in the period of 300 to 150. This makes sense. That's when Latin brought in Koine DID. That the renewed onset of propagation of the monophthongal pronunciation started about 150 and spread rapidly to comprise almost the entire population. Thus we have rhapsodos, rhapsodia in Latin, and not rhapsoidia. The negative evidence of the non-existence of neutralization of omega iota with omicron, while there is a frequent neutralization of omega to omicron, is significant and indicates that the monophthong resulting from the change oi to o did not close into u. So that's interesting. So ento, for example, or enho, for example, should be open in Hellenistic, enho and not enhu. Neutralization 25 is the non-writing of a vowel. Here are some of the examples. So vowels aren't being written, and this happens a lot in the late classical period, but 3rd century on goes away. The difference between the 4th and 3rd century rate of omission of a vowel corresponding to accentuated vowels is striking and important, seeing that there is no demonstrable phonetic cause of the cessation. By the way, of course, lowercase alpha here just means any vowel, lowercase sigma means any consonant. The capital letters, if it were a capital letter A, that would be alpha. Conclusions. The chronological distribution of neutralization 25 conforms with that of the other, as well as with that of numerous other graphemic neutralizations. In most of these neutralizations, the common feature, the decrease of incidence in the 3rd century, can be explained as due to changes in the proportion of speakers of different subdialects. The frequent omission of iota in front of a vowel indicates a condition change in iota, namely a palatalization into a semivocalic quality y. The change was independent of accent. The change began in the 5th century, and it seems to have propagated continuously during the following centuries. A gradual change from a type of accent dominated by pitch into one that became more characterized by stress makes sense as well for a lot of these things, as well as for of course, the loss of phonemic vowel length. You require phonemic vowel length in order for you to have a phonemic pitch accent. So vowel length, we see a huge number of vowel length variations in the 4th century, and then 3rd century on, they seem to go away. So it shows that the innovative subdialect had lots of people who had lost phonemic vowel length, but then that dialect lost its prestige and popularity. He talks about the different factors that could be causing it. It is obvious that due attention must be paid to the fact that other phonetic changes are involved besides the equalization of vowel length. Thus, if all tolerably frequent orthographic variations relevant to vowel length show a quite similar chronological distribution, while the two forming the neutralization of all to o deviate from this pattern, the cause of this deviation cannot be the equalization of vowel length, because this overall phonetic change must be supposed to contribute rather equally to the frequency of relevant orthographic variations. So, what are his conclusions? The phonological opposition of o and o was lost in the 4th century in almost all speakers of Attic, so that it could never recover its position as part of the majority system. On the other hand, the overall pattern of high frequency in the 4th, followed by the decrease in the 3rd, shows that the proportion of speakers lacking the phoneme of vowel length became smaller in the 3rd century, to remain so throughout Hellenistic times. So this is a very direct response I would like to offer to the wonderful Dr. Buth, who says that, the omega-omicron neutralization means loss of phonemic vowel length. That's not what the data show. It means something else is going on, which is a quality merger. That's also what Allen, of course, demonstrates. This conclusion receives especially strong support by the great difference in frequency between variations 2 and 3, that is, the difference between iota taking the place of epsilon iota, or in variation 2, which is epsilon iota taking the place of long iota, and then variation 3 where it's a short iota involved. As we saw in those examples, variation 3, the lost phonemic vowel length one, essentially vanishes. This evidence of the Hellenistic variations 2 and 3 eliminates the supposition that the homogeneous chronological distribution pattern in the variations bearing upon the equalization of vowel length might be due above all to the qualitative phonetic changes also evidenced by that pattern. Variation 87 is the interchange of pi and phi, just a couple in Hellenistic. There's only one incidence that might suggest it. The known changes of p to f and b to v are rephonologizations, and as such are not likely to produce such graphemic neutralization. However, the absence of such neutralizations of eo to ev and eo to eb is thus important evidence. There is no evidence of the fricativization changes of the phonemes p and b in Attic during the Hellenistic period. There is no evidence in neutralization 26, which is this one, to show the disappearance of the h in pre-Christian Attic, except in a quite small group of speakers. So he thinks that maybe some people could have lost the H sound, but he thinks it's pretty minor. I don't even consider it in any of the reconstructions that we'll see later. The aspirate is retained, as are all the aspirate consonants. He says the same thing about variation 88, which is tau and theta. There's no evidence of the fricativization changes of the phonemes t and the in Attic during the Hellenistic period. What about chi and kappa? There is no evidence of a fricativization change of k in Attic in the pre-Christian era. But for the time before 130 BC, an insignificant group of Attic speakers used the fricative pronunciation of ra, and that makes sense given the olion instead of oliron. In fact, there's even a comment about that, I think, in some ancient writer, possibly. Here it is, olion, olia, olion. Could be what it means. Now here's something really interesting. The neutralization of xa into sa. Not very frequent in Hellenistic times, but it did happen more frequently in the Classical Attic period. But psa probably didn't change to just a sa in Hellenistic times. Of course, zeta became a z sound during Hellenistic times. In Classical Attic, it may have been zda or dza for some speakers. Probably zda makes the most sense. Neutralization 31, two consonants being represented by one consonant. So he looks at the data a lot here. So there's a lot of it in the 4th century along with the other innovations, but unlike the others, there's an increase in frequency. But this applies just to the first half of the 3rd century, considering that there are only 11 instances with certainty in the second half of the century, which means a marked decrease. And then in the 2nd century, the incidence becomes higher again. This trend continues to the 1st century. So there's a predominance of this between vowels. Conclusions. The equalization of consonant length is clearly evidenced for Classical as well as Hellenistic Attic by the neutralization of two consonants represented by one. Now, I had a comment here I wrote about this. It may be observed that various Italian regional varieties will also make interchanges, because that's what we're seeing. Not that they're all lost or something. But we see a lot of interchanges of double consonants with single consonants and vice versa. Here, let me show you an example. So here's one. It actually has two of them. So kalikratu instead of kalikratu. What I wanted to mention was that it may be observed that various Italian regional varieties will interchange double and single consonants without diphthongalization. For example, Romanesco magina for macchina and mattina for mattina. The Roman dialect of Italian, of course, still has geminates everywhere. It just takes them away in certain places and certain environments. Also, double R is usually reduced to a single R, terra instead of terra. Robba, however, for roba, agile for agile, and so forth. So sometimes you get extra geminates in the Romanesco, as well as the loss of geminates. And they are conditioned via environment. So these happen to be consistent for the letter, phoneme, they're conditioned. But consider also in Northern Italian dialects, you have something like gallina instead of gallina and mato instead of matto. Why is all that happening then? So these happen to be conditional for the individual dialects, but if taken as a whole, one might conclude incorrectly that Italian has lost geminates in the 20th and 21st centuries. It is only thanks to the enormous sample size that allows us to make clearer distinctions in Italian. So this is my response to this, that maybe what we're seeing is the changing of certain gemination rather than the loss of geminated consonants, which is more consistent with Latin transcriptions, because Latin transcriptions always retain the geminated consonants where they occur in Greek and doesn't offer additional geminations, not normally. Even Latin will have weird geminations where they don't belong in the loss of geminations. Is it loquela or loquella? Is it cotidie or cotidie? So both of actually all of those are perfectly normal in classical Latin orthography depending on the author. It's not an indication of the loss of consonant length. It is an indication of different varieties that happen. So these things can happen in languages that have geminated consonants. So I'm not really persuaded by his argument that this absolutely has to be the loss of consonantal length. It could be. It would be somewhat unusual if Hellenistic Koine retained or restored all of the long vowels where they belonged to the majority of the population, but not the consonants. It's possible. Czech is such a language. Czech has phonemic long vowels, but as I recall, doesn't have any phonemic long consonants, maybe a double N. There is no point at time when the change of long consonant to short consonant can be said to have made a breakthrough in the population. The decrease of frequency of the neutralization in the second part of the 3rd century forms a short downward trend. So it was restored a little bit. This may be due exclusively to a more rigorous control of orthography in that century, but its synchrony with the decrease of most other neutralizations indicates that the proportion of speakers possessing the opposition of long consonant to short consonant may have been greater in the period of 250 to 200 than before or after that time. So I suppose he's not saying that all Greek lost consonant length, just that it was significantly maintained in the innovative subdialect, unlike other things where the loss of phonemic vowel length, that seems to have gone away completely in the innovative Attic than the Vulgar Attic. But the consonant length, that was actually lost in that innovative subdialect. I suppose I could get behind that, but it doesn't seem like the only explanation to me, given what I've seen in similar languages. Then the loss of consonants is variation 107. He talks about where these occur environmentally, and he concludes that the loss of final post-vocalic nu and sigma, assimilation or loss of nu, and a peculiar pronunciation of the singular str are what is here. These changes developed during the 5th and 4th centuries, while in the 3rd century the process was checked so that a smaller proportion of Attic speakers used the new pronunciation on these points. The tendency to drop final s propagated again already in the 2nd century, while the loss of final nu seems to have become more common again in the 1st century. That covers the major sound changes that were going on in the innovative subdialect of Attic in the classical period. The reconstructed classical pronunciation, of course, is a pretty well-known quantity, but we can see that even in the conservative speakers, there was a lot going on that was influenced by that innovative subdialect, closing to a, and closing to e in front of consonants. We also have in the innovative the amazing etacisms and ioticisms, so eta, upsilon, even epsilon, all converging with e, and the monophthongization of diphthongs. A lot of things that are seen in, say, Boeotian, but really crazy stuff that is really not what I had ever expected. So we have evidence of two different sound systems. Now let's get to the Phonemic Analysis by Teodorsson. There are two factors to determine the incidence of phonetically caused non-normal orthographic variance in a corpus of historical documents. One, the quality of the writer's graphonomic and phonographonomic competence. So graphonomic, how to write; phonographic, how to connect sounds with letters. Two, the proportion of writers in the language community using a certain phonemic subsystem, exclusively or parallel with another coexistent one. So we have to explain why from the 3rd century forward suddenly all the innovations get reversed. One is an improved graphonomic and phonographonomic competence, and the other is changes in the phonemic system of the writers. And of course, the second is the more logical explanation. The Attic orthographic data show some distinct features. These are early onset, 6th century, of a number of phonetically relevant orthographic variations, marked increase of frequency of these by the end of the 5th or beginning of the 4th century, rapid and in many cases radical decrease of frequency in the 3rd century of most variations, with considerable or high frequency in the 4th century, but no decrease in the frequency of the graphemic neutralizations of epsilon iota and iota in front of a consonant. So that one had already been established in the conservative variant and became essentially permanent. And omega and omicron were also essentially interchangeable, demonstrating not loss of phonemic vowel length in the Hellenistic, but rather the reintroduction of that as the norm for most speakers in Attica. Massive increase again in the 2nd and 1st century of a number of the orthographic variations, while some orthographic variations, which were frequent in the 5th and or the 4th century, remain infrequent from the 3rd century throughout the Hellenistic period. To explain the origin of this pattern, it is necessary to assume that there existed at least two subsystems within the phonology of Attic. This assumption can be shown to be correct by trying to explain the orthographic variation pattern of Attic as due exclusively to variation in the quality of the graphonomic and phonographonomic competence of the writers in different periods and or rules. The decrease of incidence of orthographic variation in the 3rd century would then, if due to this supposed improved competence only, be found universally in all significantly frequent variations. But this is not the case. It's only certain places. The absence of a decrease in the frequency of epsilon iota and iota in front of a consonant and of the omega omicron shows that the phonological foundation, that is the phonological oppositions a and e in front of a consonant, and all and o for the correct use of the relevant phonographonomic rules was lacking, so that the writers could not, in spite of their good phonographonomic competence, avoid failures. It cannot be supposed, of course, that the internalization of the rules, orthographic training, had been insufficient in exactly these highly frequent parts of the system. So the main point is there still existed in the 4th century a largely unchanged conservative phonemic system used by a considerable number of Attic speakers, but that, on the other hand, this system had undergone 2 important changes, namely e to e in front of a consonant and o to u. The phonemic vowel length is, of course, retained in the conservative system. These changes originate from the innovative popular phonemic system. The origin and propagation of the system during the 6th to 4th centuries is evidenced by extensive and largely frequent orthographic variations relevant to defined phoneme graphing correspondences. The survival of the innovative system during the 3rd and the former half of the 2nd century is demonstrated by the existence in this period of practically all these variations, although represented by only scattered instances, and by the renewed high frequency of several of these same variations in the last part of the Hellenistic period. I have a comment here I wrote. J.N. Adams in Social Variation in the Latin Language, 2013, generally cautions against assuming a vulgar type speech that is subsumed under the standard language for centuries, only to reemerge. But in the case of Latin, Adams is probably right, since the Republican type errors vanish before somewhat similar ones reappear much later. Teodorsson is probably right, since the vulgar subsystem never goes away entirely and reemerges in the same pattern after the period of decrease. And this is the error I think Teodorsson was making in the part 1 that we didn't look at today, but was of course considered in this final 3rd part. Part 1, he assumed, for example, that epsilon couldn't possibly have become e because modern Greek doesn't show that. And we would have to assume that everything that we're seeing here is just an antecedent to modern Greek. But he came to this new and I think more likely conclusion that there are 2 different systems that are in competition, one of which is eventually the innovative, one of which is eventually quashed. So the innovation of eta becoming e isn't necessarily the reason that eta becomes e later during Koine. That could be completely spontaneous, or it could have been genetic. There is good reason to suppose that most users of the conservative and the innovative subsystems, respectively, were more or less competent in at least one variant of the other subsystem, and thus possessed 2 coexistent systems. This talk of multiple variants is, of course, why I made 2 variants of each to give us, some kind of a spectrum to understand what's going on. The speech of monolingual natives of some languages is comprised of more than one phonemic system. The simultaneously existing systems operate partly in harmony and partly in conflict. This is a common phenomenon. The relative prestige of the competing systems is decisive of their propagation. When a variant is accepted and receives the support of increasing numbers of language users, it may establish itself as one possessing the highest prestige. This is interesting. The existence of the conservative phonemic system is attested for the classical as well as for much later times by extensive secondary evidence, such as grammarians, although this is often only indirectly relevant to Attic. And this is about the idea of competing and harmonizing systems in the process of change from one phonemic system to a different phonemic system of the same language. There may be a time during which parts of the 2 systems exist simultaneously and in conflict with the speech of single individuals. And also this, before a phoneme can spread from word to word, it is necessary that one of the 2 rivals shall acquire some sort of prestige. The acceptance and positive marking of a given speech variant is the outcome of sociolinguistic processes. That's what we'll talk about now. The Attic orthographic data indicate that there existed a competitive rivalry between the 2 main subsystems of phonology. During the 5th and the first half of the 4th century, by the way, I use orange for dates for centuries, just to keep my chronology straight. The innovative popular phonemic system was gaining more and more prestige and consequently spread rapidly in the population. Its origin in the lower social classes is evidenced by the primary occurrence of relevant orthographic variations in strictly private documents. Starts in the strictly private, becomes more popular even in formal documentation. From the late 5th century on, these variations are also found more or less frequently in official documents. This trend seems to have been counteracted at least from the last quarter of the 4th century. The prestige of the conservative subsystem was strengthened, and more Attic speakers preferred it to the innovative one. The results of this reaction and restoration are seen in the orthographic data of the 3rd century in particular, and of the last 3 pre-Christian centuries in general. The reaction succeeded in checking most phonetic changes for the entire Hellenistic period, while others would only be repressed for about 100 to 150 years. So now the development of the two phonemic subsystems of Attic. So he's going to show what he thinks the systems were like starting in 350, end of the classical period, right there at 350, and then every 100 years after that for these 4 centuries. So 350 BC, circa, we have these vowels, I, E, A, O, U, U, and these consonants. We have the length one. So this is going to look pretty much like the restored classical Attic of 100 years prior, more or less. We have the diphthongs, including long diphthongs. The A one is not included. He said he was uncertain about that, but this seems pretty safe that it might not have survived since it was undergoing the changes that we saw above. Of course, we have phonemic vowel length. The eta was E, of course, and omega was O. So we have some changes to the vowel system, such as epsilon iota in front of a consonant, that's what the sigma represents, being the same sound as a long iota. We also have E for all of these. So we have all of those things happening as we previously discussed. We also know that zeta would have just become z at this time. The change of E to E had probably been an important factor of the corresponding change O to O on the back axis. It makes sense that those things would have happened at the same time. Open O was only a combinatory allophone of O for the OI diphthong. We have that in English, for example. We don't have E, we do have they and hey. It starts with an E, but we don't have that vowel otherwise in normal English, at least, for example, General American or RP. We don't have just E on its own normally. We only get it in diphthongs like hey. A minor conservative subsystem preserved E, grapheme, and perhaps the original phonemic correspondent of zeta. That could be, I talked about that in my zeta video. So what happens by 250 in the conservative system? The E opens to E. So the epsilon, the short E sound, becomes a short E sound. The change was probably furthered by the vast space between E and A. Something ended up filling that vowel space. 100 years later, the long diphthongs I and oi became A and O, but the long O quality, the open quality O, was retained. So entoi in Attic and classical Attic would have been O by that point. This makes sense too from the way that things are transcribed in Latin. 100 years later, we have the completion of the loss of the long diphthongs I and oi into A and O. The new phoneme O established itself as a back counterpiece of the E grapheme on the front axis. So here's the vowel system at that point, as he just described. Now, we, by the end of all this, still have diphthong I, au, eu, oi. Looking at Latin transcriptions in the classical Latin period, 1st century BC through the 2nd century AD, this is exactly the system. This is the Romaic Lucian pronunciation. This is the Romaic variant of the Lucian pronunciation. This is, of course, like he was saying, supported by the secondary evidence, supported by what grammarians say, and supported by the transcriptions into Latin. So this really makes a lot of sense. Now, what's going on in the innovative subsystem, starting in 350 BC? So the beginning half of the 4th century. We're already at the midpoint. What's going on there? Well, he doesn't reconstruct it with phonemic vowel length. Now, he showed all kinds of things. This is something closer, I would say, to the more extreme version of the innovative subsystem. Based on his own data, though, I wouldn't necessarily have made it this way. I would have retained phonemic vowel length and also changed the A to just E. I would have merged these together, and the U as well. I found it interesting that he kept this. Oh no, the U here is to represent the diphthong oi, which has moved over here. U. Eu and au are retained, probably eu and au, which he'll, of course, discuss now. So here's the phonemic correspondence. This upsilon is u, only in diphthongs, like following a vowel. The length phoneme have been lost in all variants of the innovative subsystem. That's not what he said before, so I find that interesting. Oh, well, by 350 BC, okay, let's assume by 350 BC there's a possibility of that. Perhaps in the later 400s, or rather the earlier 400s, the lower 400s, the second half of the 5th century, it could still be there. But he says it's been lost in all variants of the innovative subsystem. Not fully convinced by that, but definitely plenty of speakers. The main variant of this subsystem probably preserved the pronunciation or pronunciation of the sound corresponding to epsilon iota in front of a vowel, as well as the epsilon. So the epsilon was e. One important variant of this system, the epsilon corresponded to e, while the epsilon iota corresponded to a, which is of course the same thing he said up here. So the epsilon changed, but the epsilon iota did not. In an extreme variant of the innovative subsystem, this latter may not have been the case. That is, the variant may have lacked the phoneme e entirely. So it could actually all have been e in an extreme variant. Furthermore, the opposition of o and o had probably been lost as a result of the change of e to e to equalize the functional load of the front and the back axes, respectively. The vowel system of this variant was probably the following. So you have e, you have e. Well, what's this e? This is the diphthong alpha iota I, which is monophthongized into e, and phonemic vowel length is lost. It's interesting, though, that he doesn't mention the a here, because the a, like you said, also is part of the conservative subsystem. That's, of course, why I made this chart, because I try to track some of this a little bit better with the evidence that he presents. It's a little bit hard when it's linear and you're only making one or two choices. Really need at least two to see all of these possibilities. But a lot of things could be going on and probably were going on based on the evidence that he presented. So it's interesting, his final summations here are a little bit different than some of the things he said previously. I get that. I change my mind all the time when I see these. I think, no, maybe it's just 50 years earlier or later, or, this is sort of how it goes. So I feel for the guy. So we still have ew and au. They're certainly just ew and au. And we have all the other changes, but it's definitely a lot simpler, and the weirdness of epsilon becoming e. The phoneme graphing correspondences are thus: we have the super duper ioticism, more even than in modern Greek, although this one isn't. This one's u. I find that interesting. In one variant of the innovative subsystem, the phoneme h had disappeared. Evidence for this is the variation in the late 5th century. But there are very few examples of this, so I didn't think it. He said it was pretty insignificant, but yeah, sure, another variant. So there are multiple variants of this innovative subsystem. I've only tried to track 2 for the most part over here. Maybe I should do more, but there's a lot of possibility. The change from g to r had also been accomplished in the speech of a considerable number of users of the innovative system, he concludes. In all variants of the innovative subsystem, the second component of the diphthongs eo and au was probably the semivocalic sound w. So not eu or au, but eu, au, eu, au. So it functionally ends up being different. So instead of euboya, it would be eubuya, 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 eubuya. 100 years later, in 250 BC, the epsilon opens to e. So it was e, but then by the middle of the 3rd century, it opens to e. The proportion of speakers using the extreme variant had been reduced very considerably and continued to decrease. 100 to 200 years later, there is no evidence of any specific change in the innovative system during the last 2 centuries of the Hellenistic period. From about the last third of the 4th century down to about the middle of the 2nd century, the proportion of speakers using the innovative subsystem decreased and remained small. In the last 1.5 centuries of the Hellenistic period, one feature of the innovative system, the monophthongization of I and oi, spread to the whole population. And we saw before that was actually something already going on with the conservative variants in the classical period, in the classical century and a half, but that was mostly quashed and then reemerges. This is perhaps an indication of a generally strengthened position of the innovative subsystem in that period, so the later Hellenistic. Concluding considerations. Here he talks about the importance of not relying so much on the secondary evidence, on just what the grammarians might say, due to contradictions and maybe conservative imitation, just and slavish imitation and so forth. It is thus time for the students of Greek phonology to abandon the overestimation hitherto bestowed on that material. And that's reasonable. This can be statistically analyzed and understood and thus has high value. Then he talks about older grammarians in English, how they, through the centuries, these are from different centuries, wanted to make sure that people would study just, private letters, how people are actually communicating and understand those errors to get a better sense of phonology rather than just from the formal stuff. It can be established that in some points, both types of evidence go together. For example, for most of the consonants, the orthophonic or other kinds of secondary evidence are not refuted by orthographic data. The letter upsilon is described by Dionysius of Halicarnassus as a front-rounded vowel, u, while iota is described as different, being unrounded. There's the conservative system and its dominance in Hellenistic times. The Hellenistic orthographic data show that the phonological opposition of e and u was preserved by most Attic speakers in that period. And there's no secondary evidence even talking about it. So it was probably something that was popular, but also thought to be something sufficiently lesser so as not to be used to teach with. So that makes sense. Whereas other things like epsilon iota becoming just long e in front of consonants became so generalized, despite its origin in the innovative system, that it was standardized. For sake of comparison, the non-rhotic pronunciation in English and British English of saying ka instead of car, that used to be something that was just a vulgarity of lower class London speech, but is now, of course, part of the standard pronunciation of all Brits and is in fact associated with the higher class pronunciation, with the upper class pronunciation. Whereas dialects that have the R sound, as in American English, that are in England, are considered less standard. The orthographic data show that eta corresponded to a closed E sound in the majority of Attic speakers, at least from the 4th century onwards. And the further change of A to E accomplished in the innovative system in classical times is not mentioned by any ancient grammarian. The clear statement by Dionysius Thrax, who was in fact Thraix, but called Thrax, that the iota in the long diphthong I was not pronounced and simply A, is of course important, and this is consistent, but then is refuted by Dionysius of Halicarnassus. So which one is right? Probably there was a little of both going on. Eventually one of these won out. The cause of the contradiction lies in the ill-defined reference common to practically all secondary evidence. Dionysius of Halicarnassus does not state in which dialect the iota adscript was pronounced, whether in the formal sociolect of some esoteric elitist group of his time or earlier times. In the latter case, his statement is purely prescriptive, or in the local dialect of the Greek community in Rome, or rather in the majority system in Athens. The evidence of the Attic orthographic data resolves the ambiguity. Being internal Attic evidence, so not dependent on the Egyptian stuff, not dependent on inscriptions in Italy, its reference to the Attic dialect is secured, and so is the chronology through the dating of the documents. The data can be related with tolerable certainty to social groups defined in time and locality. Orthographic variation occurs soon after a phonetic change has reached the critical point of producing phonemic change. Soon, that's an interesting term, soon. I'd say within 50 years, about a generation, is probably an appropriate time scale. So when we see a change, it doesn't mean it already occurred 100 years later. It could be pretty recent. I tend to agree with soon. It is only on the basis of orthographic data that it is possible to trace the very onset of most phonemic changes, locally, temporally, and sociolinguistically. Just as speech is generally not a matter of willpower, writing is largely not. I mentioned this in the beginning. The orthographic data from official Attic documents demonstrate that not even a rigorous control of orthographic correctness can eliminate this mechanism. The two Attic orthographic studies in 1974 and the present one in 1978 have yielded a more detailed and exact picture of the history of Attic phonology than that existing before. There are three main features in this more nuanced knowledge. 1. The early and socially defined origin and propagation of a series of phonemic changes in classical times. 2. The reaction against this process in the 4th century. And 3. The parallel existence of two main subsystems within the Attic dialect, at least from the beginning of the 5th century throughout the pre-Christian age. It remains to check these results against existing knowledge about the general history of Athens and the social, economical, cultural, and educational situation in the Attic community during classical and Hellenistic times, cases of similar phonological development in other languages, and sociolinguistic variation, coexistent phonemic systems, and sound change in general. So now we're going to try to understand why one thing happened, a relatively bizarre new innovative system, subsystem, and then why that got quashed. So the general opinion that linguistic change tends to be more rapid in times of political and social instability and change can easily be substantiated by actual cases. Since most sound changes begin in the lower social classes, political changes involving the advancement of these population groups will further the propagation of their innovative subdialect. Reversely, if the political influence of the upper classes, who normally tend to preserve linguistic structures, remains unchangedly strong or is strengthened, linguistic change will be restrained, and the trend of propagation of the new features may be reversed. During the 5th century, the broad masses of the citizens of Athens rose to full political power. After the death of Pericles in 429, the democracy was radicalized. The Peloponnesian War aggravated the demagogic behavior of many politicians. Oligarchic interludes were of short duration. The radical form of democracy was restored and remained in power down to the late 4th century. This circa 90-year-long period of extreme democratic rule is exactly the period for which the orthographic data demonstrate a rapid spread of the innovative popular subdialect among the population. Isn't that fascinating? We can see other examples. Also, think about what happens in Rome, in Latin. We'll compare that in a second. Under the democratic regime, the old aristocracy never ceased to aim at political and cultural power. Post-Socratic philosophers and some rhetoricians, for example Isocrates, were more or less decidedly against democracy and recommended an oligarchic political system. After the defeat of democratic Athens against the Macedonians in 338, the critics of democracy intensified their demand for a restoration of the old constitution of the fathers, that is, a Salic timocratic system, or even a timocratic system, right? Finally, at the end of the 4th century, we have these anti-democratic acts. This is the end of democracy and the beginning of more authoritarian rule. We have a moderate oligarchy at the end of the 4th century. During the first half of the 3rd century, Athens suffered under Macedonian hegemony, which was intensified after the disastrous war. The political system of Athens during the period of 196 to 166 has been called Tory democracy, and thereafter the new rulers and hegemony of Greece, the Romans, acted as solid supporters of the upper classes. After the sack of Corinth in 146 down to 129, however, there seems to have been a temporary decline of aristocratic power in Athens. It is obvious that the general political development of Athens from the middle of the 4th century onwards is not at variance with linguistic evidence. The evolution of Attic phonology evidenced by the orthography is only what could be expected. Latin now, by comparison. What happens with Latin? We have a very consistent and stable pronunciation system with very few variations for hundreds of years. Then the big event that separates the Principate from the Dominate is the 3rd century crisis. And after that, we get late Latin. After that, we get the Vulgate Bible. We get all kinds of changes. We get the Hermeneumata, the Interpretamento Hermeneumata, those which have all kinds of things that are very typical of late Latin. So this makes sense. You have a whole lot of upheaval. The power of the aristocracy is significantly challenged in the 3rd century, and so we start to see some fracturing. With the end of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century, what happens after that? We start to see a single language with rather little variation. The book Social Variation and the Latin Language by Adams, as well as, even more importantly, regional variation, which Adams also wrote, demonstrate a great deal of continuity and not a whole lot of change. Yeah, there's some change after the 3rd century crisis, but the real changes only start to happen at the beginning of the medieval period, from the 5th century onwards, after the end of that dominance. So it's very interesting how power, political power, can influence language change. Like I covered on this channel, talking about Romanitas, when something is popular and it has that power associated with it, that prestige associated with it, that's the thing that hangs on. An important example of this is how the diphthong ao became o in the vulgar Latin, right? That is in the lower class Latin or the rustic Latin. It became o. But that didn't survive into almost any Romance words, with the exception of, say, coda in Italian from cauda, and a few others, very, very few, because those long O's all merged. And where there was an actually preserved Indo-Romance merger, like coda, it's a closed O. Where it wasn't, it's open, O, like oro. So the very fact that there were rustic or vulgar, or whatever you want to call it, Latin speakers in the classical period who had aurum for aurum, that didn't get transmitted into Romance because it's oro in Italian, not oro. Why was that quashed? Why was that repressed? Because of the prestige of the more conservative dialect. It's amazing that we have a pretty good reflection of what happened with the Greek language. Also, I think it's interesting how Greek is always touted as being, this amazingly this unique language. Wow, it's so uniquely ancient and unchanged for thousands of years. No. Greek definitely has tendencies, because of all sorts of interesting political events over thousands of years, for the insertion and the desire to keep things the same, but it also has radical innovations. I'd say the tendency towards archaism is balanced by Greek's tendency as a phenomenon, as a linguistic phenomenon, essentially towards radical innovation. And I think both are more extreme than in Latin and the Romance languages, yet entirely comparable. Greek isn't unique, it's special in its own way, sure. The cultural prestige of Athens increased steadily during the 4th century, while the political power of the town suffered repeated setbacks. This development continued in the 3rd century, during which the new philosophic schools, the Stoic and the Epicurean, flourished and rapidly became influential cultural centers. Athens maintained its position as the leading center of learning in Greece throughout the Hellenistic period. Literacy was quite widespread among Athenian citizens as early as the end of the 6th century. That's important because it's a little bit like, have you noticed how many spelling errors we're all affronted with the past 20 years or so, especially text messages and other things, weird grammar and spelling and so forth. It seems like, oh no, people are getting dumber, right? That's not really what's going on. It's just that everybody has a device, a mobile device in their hand, and they use their knowledge. Pretty much everyone is literate. You have to be literate to use the most common device. Very complicated machine is now in the hands of everybody. So everybody's able to write exactly as they know. So we're going to see, this is exactly what I would expect, that the democratization of writing through, say, written messages on the internet of all types and between people, it's going to show things that were always there. But it's going to lead, I think, to increased literacy, because we also have all of the little grammarians that are always there correcting our spelling and grammar as we write all the time. So it won't be perfect teachers, but I think eventually we're going to see this, this statistical, we have a sampling error of suddenly a huge amount of errors, but then those are going to decrease over time as people learn through using their devices how to spell better. At least that's my interpretation based on these kinds of things. So there is a deliberate reaction against the corruption of writing. Well, corruption. And he means this subjectively in the minds of those who are trying to change things. The temporal coincidence of the reaction against the corruption of writing with the central period of reduction of orthographic variation is significant. To sum it up, it may be established that there is nothing in the general political, cultural, and educational history of Athens, nor in the history of Attic epigraphy, that can be said to be at variance with the evidence of orthographic data as they were interpreted in the two studies. On the contrary, the turnover in the phonological development of the Attic dialect from innovation to conservatism had a correlate in the outer political development and inner cultural trends and aims of the leading classes of the Athenian community. In a few moments, I'm going to show you some reconstructed pronunciations of Attic in the different subsystems. But first, let's look at parallels in other languages. New linguistic features may originate and spread among the lower and middle classes of a large community, but may be stigmatized as vulgar and thus repudiated by the upper classes. However, political power is an essential factor of the propagation of linguistic innovations. If a social class enlarges its political prestige, although its social status may remain low, the language form used by that class is positively marked and tends to be accepted by other, primarily the closest associated, classes. If, however, the predominating class loses its leading position and another higher social class obtains dominance, then the trend of propagation is reversed. The language form that had been positively marked even in the middle classes is now stigmatized much more strongly by the leading upper class, and, consequently, the users of that language form now make efforts to abandon it and adopt the high prestige form of the leading social groups. This happens all the time. Think of how the loss of H during the Shakespearean period was then followed by a restoration of the H sound in the standard forms of British and American English. And a few words didn't make it. For example, herb in American, herb in British. There, it completed. As early as the 4th century, there was a beginning epigonic feeling which was combined with conservatism, purism, and aristocratic views. It was quite natural that the appraisal of the good old days and the excellent old authors should lead to the idealization and preservation of their language form. Sounds like Greek in almost every period. This attitude was materialized in the Atticism of the Hellenistic and later times, indeed. A parallel with the French language. There was the 100 Years' War, there's a whole bunch of upheaval, but then there was a reaction against the popular innovations. The reaction was successful. A number of sound changes that had been accomplished in the popular subsystem were checked and repressed, such as O to U, we to E. We, I believe what example would be, say, modern French moi. Moi becomes mwe, and now it's moi. So it would have been something like me, which would come back to me, mwe to me. And then er to ar. Of course, it's not er, it's er and ach in modern French, but it would have been er. And also the intervocalic ra became a z. So something like, I guess, chéri would be, something like chéri would have been chézi, if I understand this right. I don't know anything about these sound changes, though, other than what I'm reading here. The reaction was even stronger in the 17th and 18th centuries, and thus succeeded in definitely eradicating the above-mentioned innovations. The French stigmatization of popular sound changes was quite overt. The stigmatized forms were discussed and repudiated with disgust, or turned to ridicule. This extreme stigmatization of forms of the low-status subsystem by users of the highest prestige form of the language is particularly effective for their disappearance. This is how this happens. It can happen. The resemblance between the history of the French language from the late Middle Ages down to the Revolution and the Attic development in classical and Hellenistic times is apparent. But there is one essential difference. In French, the conservatism succeeded in rooting out most of the popular innovations that originated before or begun during the period of strong reaction. Only a few changes were accepted. Generally, it was the conservative upper-class dialect that survived, to the exclusion of the other ones. The French case forms an extreme. Usually reactions against natural sound changes are only partially or temporarily successful. For example, Middle English change of in to in the present participle has now borne its stigma for at least 150 years, but is still in use. So goin' instead of going. In fact, both these sound systems are used by, I'd say, the majority of native English speakers. We use the ing, singing, going, I'm singing, but I'm singing a song, sing it more quickly. The innovation is preserved, so we actually have both. A lot of us, I do, for certain. And apparently, I wasn't aware of this, 17th to 18th century English, ga and ga changed to kya and gya. So I guess instead of cat, instead of go, gyo. Not sure how these were conditioned, but in any case, they were totally eliminated in the 19th century. The fact that the struggle against innovation in order to preserve old language forms is problematic is excellently demonstrated by the late Middle French change of we to e. So it would be like mwe, moi, mwe to me. When it was stigmatized by the grammarians and we was reintroduced, the innovative system relieved the pressure by producing a deviating change of we to wa, so moi for me, which could never be rooted out by the purists. And there's an interesting thing talking about there exist a number of concordant studies showing that the speech of women is more progressive than men's speech. Oh, look, he wrote then instead of than. This is true because a unstressed often becomes just a schwa sound. Then also just becomes so e and a become so the men's speech. He is showing this exact error. I wonder if he did it deliberately. Probably it was an accident, but I think it's a fabulous demonstration of exactly the thing he's talking about. This is a very common error for English speakers, not because we don't know the difference between then and than, but because when they're unstressed, they sound identical. As yet, there is no explanation of this phenomenon. So he talks about there may have existed distinct Genolects. He also talks about a comment by Plato about the pronunciation of women. And that comment by Plato he talks about in more detail in the 1974 paper. Here it is, where we have we have Socrates and so forth talking about this. Socrates says, "Hoion hoi men archaiotatoi, he meran ten he meran ekalvun, hoi de he meran, hoi de nun he merans." So what does this indicate? The strange thing about it is that he says that this has to do with the way that ancient people spoke, archaiotatoi. The passage has always been considered difficult. Plato clearly states that there existed at least two pronunciations of the word, heimera. Heimera with the epsilon may refer to writing, which makes sense because the eta replacing the long e or e sound was something that was common in the 5th century BC, but only became accepted as the standard in 403 BC. So Plato might have actually written this before this precise change had occurred. So there he wouldn't necessarily be talking about phonology. But should we believe him when he maintains that the E pronunciation is the old and original one? There is no other evidence to support this. It is easy to show that Plato's statement cannot be generalized to comprise the whole tentative phoneme e. apart from the overwhelming counter-evidence of comparative linguistics, it would imply that the original phoneme E, corresponding to graphemes iota and epsilon, incidentally had an inexplainable anomaly with two graphemes used from the beginning corresponding to one phoneme, underwent a split without any demonstrable cause. And that doesn't work. You can't have that split. But supposing that this actually took place, the new phoneme A, arisen through the hypothetical split of E, would have merged with the already existing phoneme A, arisen through contraction or compensatory lengthening, before it reached the stage E, as in he mera. It is obvious then that the passage must be interpreted in another way. If we do not suppose that it is altogether nonsense, the only possible interpretation is that there actually existed more than one pronunciation at the same time, and that the narrow quality A or E must have existed in the dialect of a part of the Attic population for a considerable length of time when Plato wrote his Cratylus. Going back to the 1978 paper, if it is meant to be something other than nonsense, it must be interpreted in the diametrically opposite direction to that intended by Plato himself. And there's a Cicero quote, I recall, I don't remember where it is, but he talks about women also retaining the older pronunciation, which seems to have been maybe just an idea, perhaps a fanciful idea that was thought to be, as common knowledge, that women retained the old way of speaking, and somehow that was just something culturally true for both ancient Roman and ancient Greek philosophical people thinking this, because the exact opposite seems to be true in most linguistic studies. And indeed here, it makes much more sense to believe that this is the innovative version. Sure, it might have come from a generation before, and then the philosopher men like Plato just kind of noticed it and assumed it was of the archai jotatoi instead of, in fact, being a more innovative pronunciation, which is the only possible way to interpret it. Given all of the orthographic evidence, that seems to be exactly what's occurred. The opposite direction, namely that the E pronunciation of women was an innovation, while the E pronunciation, practiced by the conversial philosophers, was a conservative variant fostered by tradition in the outer world of men. Attic and Koine. The present study has shown that the conservative subsystem of Attic had a stronger position in Hellenistic than in classical times. And that's the really amazing revelation. That which we think of as the restored classical pronunciation of Attic Greek, of classical Greek, was actually less popular in classical times than later. Amazing. A similar relationship was found to exist between Ptolemaic Koine and classical Attic. Both of them, though, had to accept some of the new patterns. In the Roman and Byzantine periods, this development continued. Everywhere in the Greek-speaking area, the progressive subsystem, which originally derived from Old Attic, he maintains, was finally victorious and established itself as the standard, while the conservative pronunciation was carefully preserved by esoteric purist groups for many more centuries. Now, I write here, I don't think this is necessarily the case. That is, the eventual developments found in late Koine, such as typified by Buthian pronunciation, were not all preserved from the 5th century BC innovative Attic, for example, upsilon going to E in innovative Attic, while the majority Koine into Byzantine, upsilon remained U. That's demonstrated in the various dialects, so it's not necessary as an explanation. Some of the innovations obviously did become the general way that both conservative and innovative Koine spread around the Mediterranean and beyond, but that doesn't mean every innovation that comes after had its origin there. There are a lot of common traits in pretty much all of the spoken modern Greek, like palatalization, that seems to have been in general phenomenons, but it can originate in one place and then spread throughout. It doesn't actually have to all come from Attica at one time. It could. It's a reasonable explanation, but while Teodorsson takes the strong version of that argument, I would prefer the weak version of that argument. For the Hellenistic era, the Attic data indicate a stronger position of the conservative subsystem than the Ptolemaic data do. This is not an unexpected outcome considering the favorable conditions for conservatism and purism in Hellenistic Athens, with its philosophic and rhetoric education centers, and its rather static oligarchic political system. There is some evidence that one change, U, the graphic upsilon, and the omicron iota, oi, going into E never became general in Attica, and he mentions here the U into U. I talked about this in the upsilon video. There seem to exist two possibilities with dialects like Taconian, as well as the 19th century Attic or Athenian pronunciation, where there was U, where one would expect E. Either it's something preserved from antiquity, or it is in fact the backing of the front rounded vowel. So it's going from U back to U. In general, because we see palatalization occurring, in most of those examples, it's more likely a general backing, which is super weird, but it's the simpler explanation, as opposed to just preserving an old system, which is some evidence, but it's, I think, on the whole, the backing of the front rounded vowel makes more sense for most of those situations. Written Koine was a uniform language. Variation is mainly stylistic and lexical. The range of variation in spoken Koine, and the vast area where it was used, has not yet been mapped out in detail. More knowledge of the matter could certainly be gained by systematic investigations of orthographic variation in the texts from different regions. I think Ben Cantor is doing that, so I hope to see that work soon. Koine did not, like Latin, diverge into separate languages. Now, this actually isn't true, and this is something that is circumstantial to political development more than it has to do with some uniqueness of ancient Greek passing into modern Greek. Indeed, modern Greek has these variants. There's, of course, Standard Modern Greek, but there's Yevanic, Cypriot, Cappadocian, Pontic, Crimean, and Greco, as well as Calabrian. So, and then, of course, there's ancient dialects as well. Now, those are just about as numerous as the Romance languages. The only reason that the Romance languages truly separated was because of the political developments that occurred. Medieval Greek, wherever it survived, mostly in Greece, well, mostly under the Roman Byzantine Empire, mostly under one nation. There was no political need to diverge the languages. So while there are certainly divergences equivalent to those found in Romance, I mean, gosh, Pontic has infinitives and Standard Modern Greek doesn't. That's a huge difference. That's at least as big as the difference between Romanian, which also lacks infinitives, and Italian. The reason that the Romance languages are not considered Latin is purely a political consideration. It starts with Dante, who wants to write in the vulgar Latin dialect of his town and the way that people commonly speak instead of the grammatica, that was the formal Latin. It was all called Latin, though. What they spoke in Spain in the 13th century was Latin, and in Portugal and in France and in all of Italy, it was all understood to be Latin, just very different from the grammatica, as they called it, as Dante called it in the Middle Ages. But the national identity, combined with cultural identity, started to individuate these various dialects of Latin that had gone through obviously different kinds of evolutions in the intervening centuries. And the differences were emphasized and appreciated. Different spelling systems became necessary and so forth. Whereas these other dialects, if 700 years ago, these dialects had significant nationalistic tendencies within their respective cultures, they may have ended up calling themselves different languages, and they might still have a huge amount of intelligibility between one and the other, just as is true between the various Romance languages. The difference between language and dialect is not easily defined, and it has to be defined separately for every situation or every language group. In this case, there is a great deal of mutual intelligibility among these dialects, but there is also in Romance. Big outliers like French, which have quite an interesting and very different phonetic evolutionary history in modern times, distinguish French as being kind of an outlier, but the rest of the Romance is basically in line, as are most of these modern Greek languages or dialects with Standard Modern Greek. So that's the idea that Koine did not, like Latin, diverge into quite separate languages is incorrect. This is not a correct assessment of what's going on, which would have been entirely natural considering the large extension and geographic disparity of the Greek-speaking world. Also, consider how the few areas where dialects have remained outside of Greece, that Greek is still spoken, are in places where the dominant languages, Turkish, for example, Greek was spoken as the main language in Egypt. That's gone. So these places are all got extinguished where they survived largely in the Western Roman Empire in the case of Latin. So this is not a very well thought out argument, in my opinion. The uniform or written language certainly contributed very much to the standardization of the spoken language. I think this is a very reasonable position. Literacy was probably very widespread, But the influence from the written language through its use in speech cannot be supposed to have furthered the innovative phonological tendencies of the language, but rather to have supported the conservative phonological system. I think that's generally true. It's not always true. Innovations do occasionally come from the educated or the erudite. For example, in English today, it's extremely common to hear people of a moderate to high, even high level of education say, it's a gift for you and I, which is totally wrong. For I is wrong. It's for me. It's a gift for me and you would be the best prescribed way of saying that. But that error has now diffused into all kinds of levels. So if we imagine there's sort of 4 levels of English, which is arbitrary, there's a more conservative subsystem, a more innovative subsystem. The one where for him and I has taken, there's for me and him, there's for me and you, that would be the most conservative and the most prescriptively correct. For you and I is, for you and I, this is difficult for me to say, for you and I would be like this lower level, the moderately educated, but there are a lot more people in that group, so that has now been picked up by this level. So now saying for you and I has become largely diffused and someday might be correct in English grammar. Another example of this is the word ain't. Ain't is the contraction of am not. I am not. We say I'm not, normally in, say, Journal American, as well as most varieties of British English, I'm not. But to say I amn't or I ain't has been greatly stigmatized. Now, why is that? The reason for that is ain't got used outside of the first person singular, outside of I, so not just I ain't. It's not just I ain't, you aren't, he isn't, but I ain't, you ain't, he ain't, we ain't, they ain't, and so forth. So using ain't for all of the persons. And that prescriptively is obviously wrong because it should just be am not, the first person singular. But it got diffused throughout the population, ain't, and thus was entirely stigmatized as wrong for all the persons, even though for the first person singular it is correct. So we say, aren't you? Isn't he? Isn't she? Aren't we? Aren't they? And thus it should be, amn't I? Ain't I? That's correct, technically, prescriptively. However, because it was stigmatized so much in Standard British and American English, amn't I or ain't I, no one says that anymore without thinking that it sounds wrong. And thus, aren't I are I? That's wrong, right? So that's an example of a very successful hypercorrection that has kind of ruined permanently a part of standard English grammar because no one can now say ain't I or amn't I in standard British or American English and get away with it. That's not true of, say, Scottish or Irish variants of English, where in school today I believe it's still presented as correct to say amn't I or ain't I, or I ain't, and so forth. I'm, of course, perfectly fine with that more antique form. So normally, yes, innovations don't necessarily come from the erudite or the upper class or more educated groups, but they do sometimes. This is also true of the restoration of the letter H, even in places where it doesn't belong. The source of innovation and evolution must have been the spoken language of everyday use. But the question arises, how could this evolution of the spoken standard proceed so uniformly in the whole language area? It didn't, though. There's all kinds of differences between Pontic and Greco. They're similar, but so are the Romance languages, so I'm not sure what he's getting at. It seems there are 2 conditions essential to this development. The origin of Koine must have been one well-defined language form. That's fair, though, to assume that everything that spread outside of Greece, and then eventually that which took over all of the old dialects of the classical period, was just Koine, not many different dialect forms as the source of origin. There are a lot of exceptions, though, say in Siconian as well as the Doric influence on Greco. The phonological evolution of Koine must have been prepared and initiated in the parental language form, that is, in the Ionic Attic Koine, the Great Attic, used in the Aegean area in late classical times before the emigration to the new overseas countries and the propagation of this Aegean Koine there, as well as the Old Greek-speaking region. The Ionic Attic Koine that was exported outside its original area throughout the conquests of Alexander and the Macedonian hegemony was essentially Attic, and thus quite a uniform language form. But it possessed at least 2 phonological subsystems, one conservative and one innovative. In the latter, the vowel system had already undergone profound changes, while the consonantal system was only in the initial stage of evolution. However, the first steps have been taken in the direction of change that is evidenced later all over the Koine area. I don't agree. He demonstrates that so many of these things were actually quashed entirely. The transformation of epsilon into an E sound, that went away. It's possible that some people that lost phonemic vowel length and used stress accent already, they probably did exist in Attica in some degree. I don't know in what numbers. He seems to think some amount of the innovative speakers were doing that. But that's a kind of change in language that is reasonably common all over Indo-European, so there's no reason it couldn't have happened separately later. It didn't have to be influenced by a subdialect that was just hiding and waiting, especially given the other changes that didn't take hold. Upsilon merges with Omicron iota much later as the general phenomenon, and not with iota until the 10th century or later, and then not even in all speakers. Gamma changing into Ra, which was the first step in the fricativization of the series Badaga, a shift that was connected with the change of Eu Au into Eu Au, and then eventually Eu Au, but this is not attested in Attic, before a vowel or a voiced consonant, while the parallel change of Eu Au, Eu Eu into F Av was the first step towards fricativization of the aspirate series Pataka. Right, and I say, not necessarily. Indeed, I would say this is an incorrect assumption. Laconic had fricative theta and perhaps others without the need for fricativization of au and eo, and we have parallel evidence for such a system in Pompeii. See my Phi Theta Chi video. Meanwhile, in Egypt, au and eo became fricativized while the aspirates remained aspirates. So I used to, even in the original Lucian pronunciation video, Raphael Turrigiano and I assumed this exact same thing, that you would have to have one triggering the other. Absolutely possible, but we have very clear evidence that they also evolved as separate phenomena, that the fricatives evolved into fricatives separate of the change of the au and eo diphthongs changing into the false diphthongs, and that the false diphthongs also occurred in Egypt independently of the aspirates changing. So this absolutely could have driven fricativization in general Koine, but not necessarily. Thus, the late classical Attic bore the embryos, as it were, of the coming phonological evolution of Koine. This theory will probably be of use for the explanation of the uniformity of Koine and, consequently, the coherence of modern Greek dialects as deriving from Koine. Again, I disagree with this. However, further research is needed to see if this model works or if there are other additional factors in the origin and development of Koine. So, that is this amazing work. I said, I agree with almost all of it. I think it's very convincing for an innovative dialect that does, I think, this super weird, cool thing where epsilon actually changes to E in the 5th century, and that the less innovative of the innovative subsets here in the variant had either E or E. I have generally avoided using the arrow, which looks like an upside down T or a T, for true mid or very high E and so forth, because it just gets to be pretty complicated and it's really not necessary. One can imagine all kinds of transitions, so I didn't want to get too in the weeds with those as I was placing these, at least in the current version of this. But it's entirely possible we have a near merger of A and E for the whole innovative subsystem, and that, as he was saying, this is also getting to be true again in the conservative, at least some of the conservative subsystem, which is amazing because we see it in the official documents. And then I have in the beginning of the 4th century, in the first half, that the E, that was still there, but was going towards E again. Maybe I should switch these to make it clear what I mean about this. So what would that sound like? Here I've taken a few lines from the Protagoras by Plato and rendered it in 4 different pronunciations that may have actually existed in the classical Attic period, according to Teodorsson. So the blues are the conservative subsystem, and the golds are the innovative subsystem. And essentially, like a rainbow, they go from most conservative to most innovative. I would put these possible pronunciations, if I had to give them a year, all at the year 400 BC. So the most conservative system looks like this. Eu emuige edoksen ok hekista dekai teinun he mirai. Something important is that epsilon is always E and not E. An archaic feature is that the Omicron upsilon is U instead of U. Who knows if that was preserved as late as the year 400. This would certainly be a very minority pronunciation. Naturally, certain features that might be in a level below could be in a level above. I'm mostly just trying to show a spectrum of possibilities. The conservative variant with some innovations. We have eo emuige, so not imuige, but emuige, so muige, emuige. Edoksen, ook instead of ook. This is probably general for pretty much everyone, but I wanted to include the more archaic one as well, since I think some people might have had it. Ook hekista, so now he has become he. Hekista dekai dei instead of dei. Di nun he mira. The iota subscript, the long vowels have monophthongized. In reality, looking at my chart here, I should probably just make it a long monophthong for de. So de nun he mira probably makes more sense for this less conservative variant in the conservative subsystem. Now the innovative ones. For all of the innovative, I have generalized epsilon into e, except in the eu diphthong. Eu I mu gi. Eu I mu gi. Idosin ook hi kista dike di nin hi mira. So, of course, the H sound, ha, is preserved in the innovative subdialect, except for very few speakers, as he mentioned, so I'm keeping it all around. Still pitch accent in this version, as well as phonemic and consonant length. The ksha has now become just a long sa, idosin, idosin. The diphthongs have monophthong eyes, so not eu but eu, and not ui but u, and instead of I, a. Could it also be e instead of a? Certainly. I just like the a sound, since it makes a lot of sense for the orthographic errors, where it's just kappa alpha for this exact word. So that makes much more sense as ka instead of ke. We see similar things in Ptolemaic Koine. Eta has etasized, it is ioticized, as well as the upsilon has become e. Weird stuff. Kind of like modern Greek, very much not in other ways. And finally, a version without phonemic vowel length, pitch accent, or geminated consonants, and thus with stress accent. Ewimuki, idosi, final N is also lost. Ukikista, diketinin himira. So the H, the H, the aspirate, like I said, is still there. Aspirated consonants are, of course, retained, not at all like modern Greek. I've also used the vowel sound e, since I think that makes the most sense for something very innovative. Really weird. Sounds kind of like modern Greek, but strange, almost like a dialect of modern Greek, another modern Greek language. Next line, most conservative. Kai garpolla hyperemo epe boeton emui. Less conservative. Kai garpolla hyperemu, so u. Epe, a has become e in front of consonants. Epe boeton, so closing of the two long vowels. Boeton emui. The diphthong is narrowing. Innovative one. Kai garpolla hyper, not hyper, but hyper. Hyperimu, not emu, but imu. Hyperimu. Not going to find something quite like this in modern Greek. Hyperimu, ipi, instead of ipe. Ipi, boiton, imu. And finally, we lose phonemic vowel and consonant length, and we have stress accent. Gagarpola, hyperimu, ipi, boiton, imu. Next line. Conservative 1. Gaion, kaiarti, apekeno, erkomai. Conservative 2. Gaiun, kaiarti, apekinu. We have the closing of both those vowels. Apekinu, erkomai. It's even possible that the I would have become I in this one, so a slightly narrowing of the diphthong could also have happened. More like Latin, kai instead of kai. Innovative 1. Gaiun, kaiarti, apekinu, irkome. Innovative 2. Keun kearti apikinu irkome. Weird stuff. Next line. Conservative 1. Atopum, this is the assimilation of the N into the M sound. So, atopum mintoi tissoi etelo epin parontos garekenu. Conservative 2. Atopum mentui tissoi etelo epin parontos garekenu. Innovative 1. Atopum mintu tissu itilo ipin parontos garikinu. And innovative 2. Atopum mintu tissu itilo ipin parontos garikinu. And that might also have been the loss of the final S. Paronto garikinu. Last line, conservative 1. O te prosekon ton non, epelantanomen tauto tama. Conservative 2. Uti prosikon ton nun, epelantanomin teautu tama. Innovative 1. Uti prosikon ton nun, ipilantanomin teautu tama. So we have autu, but assuming a loss of the final element in au in the most innovative, so we're going to have atu instead of autu. Uti prosikon ton nun, ipilantanomin teautu tama. So that is a look into the weird and wacky world of what Classical Attic actually sounded like, according to Teodorsson. That is, Classical Attic period, there were speakers using conservative and innovative pronunciations. Not surprising that such variations could have existed, but kind of startling that the variations were so divergent from the extant classical restored pronunciation that we're used to, with an innovative subsystem that was in some ways like modern Greek, but in other ways way more advanced, way more innovative, way weirder, like the x becoming just sh, e becoming e. Weird stuff. Hope you found this interesting. For now, I'll say hygienete.